Well, in this video, we want to talk a little bit about the historical background of the New Testament. In particular, we want to compare two kings, King Herod the Great, who was the Roman appointed ruler of Israel at the time of Jesus' birth, and then also compare him with King Jesus. Two kings, both building kingdoms. Herod the Great building a physical kingdom, which we'll see in just a minute, and of course Jesus Christ building a spiritual kingdom. To begin, though, we just have to remember that the Old Testament prophet Daniel gives a general overview of history in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You might want to read Daniel chapter 2, which talks about this dream that King Nebuchadnezzar has of a huge statue that's made up of different metals. And the different metals represent different kingdoms that will come and go during the intertestamental period. And those kingdoms in Daniel 2, most people agree that the head of gold refers to Babylon, which is the current kingdom when Daniel wrote this. And then the second kingdom refers to Persia, who defeated the Babylonians, but then along came Greece. They defeated Persia and under the rule of Alexander the Great. And then finally, along came Rome. And it's the Roman Empire that is in charge now when we get to New Testament history. The birth of Jesus and the growth of the church in the first century all occurs under the rule of Rome in the Roman Empire. In Daniel chapter 2, when Daniel interprets the dream, he not only talks about those successive kingdoms that will come and go, but he also refers to the kingdom of God, which will be set up and will never be destroyed. He envisions it as a rock that comes down a mountain and strikes the base of that huge statue that represents all the human kingdoms and crushes all of those kingdoms. And so that rock represents the kingdom of Jesus Christ that will be established over all other kingdoms. And that's what leads us to New Testament history, because Jesus comes to set up his kingdom on earth as its superior to all the other human kingdoms. So here's a map of the ancient Near East, and you can see the colored area is the territory of the Roman Empire right around the birth of Jesus. And the Romans control everything, including the small little country of Israel over here, which of course is where Jesus was born and where he engaged in his public ministry. Here you see a list of the Roman emperors that intersect with New Testament history. The first one listed there is Caesar Augustus, and he's the Caesar in charge when Jesus is born. In fact, he's referred to in Luke chapter 2, if you remember the Christmas story, in the days of Caesar Augustus, and then the birth of Jesus. Caesar Tiberius is the Caesar when Jesus is an adult engaging in his ministry. Claudius and Nero, you see down the list there, are two emperors who began a persecution of Christians. This is after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, when the church is being established, and these two emperors persecute Christians. And then the last one on the list there is Emperor Domitian. And he's the Roman emperor who does more than any other to destroy Christianity and to get rid of the church. Domitian is the emperor when John writes the book of Revelation. It's a story of the persecution of the church and the victory of the kingdom of Jesus Christ against that terrible background. So let's talk specifically about the local Roman appointed ruler over the area of Israel. His name is Herod the Great, and you can see he reigned from 37 to 4 BC. Jesus' life was from 6 BC to 27 AD. So you can see that they really only overlap for 2 years. But we want to talk a little bit about the kingdom that Herod was building and the kingdom that Jesus was building. Herod the Great was not a nice guy. He had 10 wives, at least 43 children. He executed Miriam and Miriam's mother, his wife Miriam, and her mother, and two of his own sons, because he thought they were kind of angling for the throne. He ordered the execution of a lot of Israel's citizens just before his death. He knew he was going to die, but he knew that nobody in Israel would mourn his death because they hated him. And so he wanted these people to be killed when he died so that there would be mourning in Israel on his death. Of course, you remember in the New Testament, it's Herod the Great who slaughtered all of the infants 2 years and younger in Bethlehem after the birth of Jesus, hoping to kill Jesus. The thing that Herod is known for, though, is that he was a master builder. He wanted to build a physical kingdom, which was in honor of his power and of his position as king. So I want to talk about some of those building projects and how those things intersect with New Testament history. The first one is something called Caesarea Maritima. Caesarea is the name of the city, named after Caesar, so Caesarea. Maritima is a word that refers to the sea. This is a city that Herod the Great built right along the Mediterranean Sea. And you can see an artist's picture of it there. It was a harbor city. The most amazing thing was the breakwater that you see right here that Herod the Great built out into the Mediterranean Sea so that ships could come in and dock. There was a temple to Caesar Augustus. There was a hippodrome. There was a palace with a swimming pool out front that jutted out into the Mediterranean Sea. And then, of course, in Roman style, there was a Roman amphitheater right here. Herod the Great constructed a 25-mile-long aqueduct from Mount Carmel down to Caesarea along the sea so that it could bring fresh water to this port city. And here you see still today the remains of that amazing aqueduct that Herod the Great built to carry water down to this new city. There it is again. There you see a picture of the aqueduct right here along the beach to bring fresh water. The artist's drawing of the city. There's what it looks like today. You can see the theater, which has been reconstructed, and here's the hippodrome and the remains of that palace that with the swimming pool that juts out into the Mediterranean Sea. There's an artist's rendering of what it might have looked like in the first century with that theater and the palace and the swimming pool. And here you see the hippodrome. There's an aerial photo of what Caesarea looks like today. There's the theater and the hippodrome right there, and then that palace right there. Here's an aerial photo of Caesarea today. These dark spots in the water are the remains, the underwater remains of that breakwater that Herod the Great constructed out into the sea so that he could receive ships. There you see the underground remains. The photo of what it looks like today. The underwater remains of the breakwater. There's a photo of an artist's drawing of how they might have constructed that breakwater with wooden frames and filled with cement that would be sunk to the bottom of the ocean to construct that breakwater. Artists' drawings of that amazing city. There's the hippodrome and the theater in the background and the remains of that palace. There's the palace, well, it's all that's left of it now. That palace that jutted out with the swimming pool here into the Mediterranean Sea, and there's the remains of it today. Nothing left. There's a picture of Kuiper students a few years ago when we visited Israel and visited Caesarea. Something that was found at Caesarea was something called the Pilate stone. Pontius Pilate, of course, was mentioned in the New Testament and participated in the crucifixion of Jesus, and he was the Roman ruler of Israel at the time of Jesus' death, and he resided in Caesarea. And here's a stone with his name and his title on it, confirming the historicity of Pontius Pilate and his mention in the New Testament. There's a picture you see of the theater, and this verse from Acts 23, which talks about Paul being transferred as a prisoner to be held at Caesarea Maritima. And then if you read Acts, Paul defends his Christian faith and does so right in the theater there in Caesarea Maritima. So a lot of history with this city. Herod the Great built the city because he wanted to import Roman culture into Israel. Well, little did he know that the city also provided a port so that the gospel later could be exported to the entire world. So while Herod the Great was building a physical kingdom to support Roman culture and his power, it also provided the means for the gospel to go around the world. Another one of the building projects of Herod is something called the Herodian. And this is a fortress palace that Herod the Great built just 1 mile away from Bethlehem, right here. Because people in Israel hated him, he wanted to build a series of fortress palaces so that he could make his escape. And the Herodian was the one that he built that was closest to Bethlehem. There you see a photograph of it today. It was sort of a volcano-shaped mountain. He literally moved a mountain, moved dirt into the form of a volcano, and then built a palace at the very top of it. There you see an artist drawing of the palace that Herod the Great built, with dining rooms and storage rooms, and here was his own private living quarters at the top of this high tower, the Herodian. There's an artist drawing of the palace at the top of the Herodian. There was a lower palace with a swimming pool and a gazebo. Amazing thing. There it is again. There's a photograph of what it looks like today, at least the remains of the lower palace and the swimming pool and the gazebo. There's the remains of that tallest tower at the top of the mountain, at the top of which would have been Herod's private living quarters. There's an aerial photo of what remains today. One of the amazing things about this is you can remember the story of when Herod killed all those babies in Bethlehem, hoping to get rid of Jesus. The Herodian here overlooks the city of Bethlehem, and I can just imagine Herod at the top of his living quarters looking over that little town of Bethlehem and wondering to himself, did I get him? Did I get him? Well, of course, we know that he didn't get Jesus Christ, and Jesus went on to build his spiritual kingdom. Scholars have wondered for years exactly where Herod the Great was buried. They suspected that it was at the Herodian, and just about 5 years ago, archaeologists actually discovered the tomb of Herod the Great, and sure enough, he's buried at the Herodian. That X marks the spot where they discovered the tomb of Herod the Great. There you see what they uncovered, some of the remains of his tomb. There's the tomb, just about halfway down the mountain of his burial place. And there you see the Herodian again with the burial place of Herod and the palace at the top. Herod's tomb, the sarcophagus that he was buried in. Here's an interesting verse from Matthew 17 when Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he said, because you have so little faith, truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing is impossible for you. Well, I think maybe Jesus said that as he was passing by the Herodian one day with his disciples, where Herod the Great literally moved a mountain to build a physical palace. Here, of course, Jesus is saying to his disciples, you have that same power, not to build a physical kingdom, but to build the spiritual kingdom of Jesus Christ, if you have faith in me. You can read the story in Luke 2 of the shepherds and in Matthew 2 of the wise men going to Bethlehem to worship Jesus and having to walk right past this amazing palace at the Herodian. The true king was not a king of power and palaces, but was a baby in a manger. Another one of those fortress palaces that Herod the Great built is called Masada. And there you see the picture of this fortress, this big rock out in the Judean wilderness, right near the Dead Sea. You can see the Dead Sea, the top of the picture there. Herod the Great built a palace on top of this rock to protect himself. Here you see Jerusalem, which is up in the mountains, and Bethlehem, and then down near the Dead Sea is Masada, 1,300 feet below sea level. Herod the Great built a fortress palace on the top of that rock. And you can see some of the pictures here of Masada. Here at the north side of that rock is the three-tiered palace that Herod the Great built. What an amazing piece of construction that is. Herod the Great wanted to challenge nature, and so he did by building this three-tiered palace out on the front of this rock to protect himself. There's an artist's drawing of what it might have looked like in the first century, the palace and the wall and other buildings up on top of Masada. He had a sauna, storehouses for food up there. There you see a picture of the storehouses. There's the three-tiered palace again. There's an artist's drawing of what it might have looked like. Here's Psalm 18 that was written by David as he was fleeing from Saul, who was trying to kill David. And David writes this psalm about who he thinks his protection is. He writes, I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. God is my rock, in whom I take refuge. The word for fortress there, the Hebrew word is mitsudah, Masada. David was saying that the Lord is his fortress. The Lord is his protection. Herod the Great thought that he could build a physical fortress that would be his own protection. The most amazing thing, though, that Herod the Great built in his lifetime was the Jerusalem temple. Just before the birth of Jesus, Herod the Great built a beautiful, huge temple in Jerusalem for the Jews. And of course, this is the temple that Jesus would come to when he would die on a cross and be buried in Jerusalem and then rise from the dead. Here you see a model. This is a miniature model of what it might have looked like in Jesus' day, this huge temple mount. And the royal stoa, the temple itself, stood 13 stories high in Jerusalem. And this is the temple that Jesus came to when he was an adult. Here you see a photograph of Israel today, and you can just barely make out the rectangular shape of that temple mount from 2,000 years ago where the temple stood. But of course, you can see right here, this golden dome building is not the temple. The temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And what this building is here is called the Dome of the Rock. And it's the third holiest site in Islam. In other words, the Dome of the Rock is built exactly on the spot where the Jerusalem temple stood in Jesus' day. Here you see a picture of the temple itself that Herod the Great built. This temple stood 13 stories high. It's a huge building. And there are stories in the New Testament of Jesus coming on various Jewish festivals to this temple to celebrate and to announce the kingdom of God coming to earth. Here's a passage from Luke chapter 2, which describes the story of when Mary and Joseph brought Jesus to Jerusalem when he was only 12 years old. And it says here in verse 46, after 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And so at the age of 12, Jesus was here talking to various Jewish leaders. Here's a passage from John 10, which says that Jesus was in the temple courts walking in Solomon's colonnade. This structure in the back is what's called Solomon's colonnade. So Jesus was there. And then here's Acts 2. This is after Jesus' death and resurrection, and it says that every day the early Christians continued to meet together in the temple courts. So even after Jesus' ascension, the early Christians met in this area of the temple. What you're looking at here in the red circle is the location of Jesus' death and also his burial, all in the same spot. You can see its proximity to that huge Temple Mount that Herod the Great built, and this is where Jesus was crucified. There you see a close-up of the area right here where Jesus was crucified. And there it is again. Today, over that area, over this area right here, stands a church. It's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it's a church that's been built over the site of Jesus' crucifixion, obviously to commemorate his death and his resurrection. Here you're looking at the Western Wall, and the Western Wall is a well-known site in Jerusalem today. It's considered the holiest site in Judaism. And the Western Wall is the only surviving piece of the Temple Mount wall, this retaining wall that Herod the Great built just before the birth of Jesus. There you see the section that still remains, the Western Wall, and it used to be called the Wailing Wall because the Jews would gather there to mourn the loss of the temple, which was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. This is the only piece of that wall that survives, and still today, Jews gather at this wall to remember their temple, which was destroyed so long ago. There you see some of the Israeli military, some of the ceremonies take place at the Western Wall. And there you see the wall in the background. Here you see some of the Orthodox Jews who go to the wall quite often to study the Old Testament and to pray. So we really have a profile in contrast. Two kings building two kingdoms, Jesus and Herod the Great. Different character, different power, a different vision for the world. Herod the Great building a physical kingdom of strength and power in honor of himself, and Jesus building a spiritual kingdom who would give himself in sacrificial death. If you think about it, which kingdom survives still today? Well, obviously it's the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And if you go to Israel today, you'll be able to see the physical remains, well, they're really ruins, of the physical building projects of Herod the Great. Two kings and two kingdoms.